House fit for a tyrant, protesters storm the sprawling, luxury estate of Ukraine's fugitive president, which has its own private zoo, golf course and is half the size of Monaco. Protesters took full control of the residence after the security detail charged with protecting the compound fled. Property is around an hour's drive from Kiev and stands as a symbol of the folly of the country's ousted president. Visitors rubbed their eyes in disbelief as they entered the compound and saw the scale of opulence. 140-hectare estate has a garage full of luxury sports cars below the house in Mezhyhirya, an hour's drive from Kiev. Anti-government demonstrators stormed the house on the day President Viktor Yanukovych fled the capital. His arch-nemesis Yulia Tymoshenko was released from prison and made a speech at Independence Square. Congratulated protesters for freeing the cancer from Ukraine and called victims of the violence heroes. The root of the problems in Ukraine stem from a political divide between the East and West. A beautiful forested estate of graceful waterways, summer houses and exotic gardens. This is the home of Ukraine's fugitive president, who was dramatically ousted from power after one of the worst periods of violence in the country's history. Ukrainians streamed to see Viktor Yanukovych's luxury estate, which has been closed off to the world for nearly a decade, and rubbed their eyes in disbelief when they were confronted by the scale of the opulence he built around him. The property in Mezhyhirya, an hour's drive from Kiev, has a golf course, helicopter pad and is situated in a country where the average salary is less than £300 a month. Below the house, a garage is filled with classic sports cars worth millions, while in the exotic gardens Australian and African ostriches stretch their legs. Locals said that up to 3,000 security and support staff would arrive when Yanukovych planned a major social event. Yanukovych, 63, who fled into hiding on Saturday as the turmoil of 3 months' confrontation with his people caught up with him, relaxed at weekends in luxury behind high walls patrolled by scores of security guards. When the dream ended and Yanukovych's staff fled the Gatsby-like mansion in the early hours of Saturday, the Kiev protest movement that had opposed him invited Ukrainians to go to see the opulence Yanukovych lived in. As they poured in their thousands, by foot and by car, onto the 140-hectare grounds for a first glimpse at a luxury they could only suspect, Ukrainians gawped in wonderment at the fairy-tale surroundings. What they saw reflected more the inflated dreams of a Middle East potentate with all the attendant obsessions with security rather than a rough-hewn man from the gritty eastern Ukraine who got to the top the hard way. Yanukovych bought a small house on the plot at the start of his presidency in 2010. Subsequently, according to local media, he acquired control of the full estate which exists today through a chain of companies with which he had close interests. Beyond a 5-floor Russian-style house, some said it was his guest house. A stone staircase opened up to a landscaped vista of water features, arboreal walkways and tree-lined avenues stretching into the distance. Few people apart from Yanukovych's chosen few and family have visited a secret place which has been charted by satellite images that show a helicopter pad and a golf course. With Yanukovych obsessed by security and fear of attack, they had to leave their mobile phones at the entrance to the grounds and pick them up only on leaving, locals said. "This is a monument to a tyrant which we want to show the people," said Eduard Leonov, a parliamentary deputy from the far-right nationalist Svoboda party. Greco-Roman statues, a goddess covering her modesty with her hair, lovers intertwined decorated the lawns. Ornate ponds half frozen on Saturday nonetheless bubbled with water being pumped through them. Love seats and colonnaded meeting places dot the estate. There is a Russian bathhouse closed to the public on Saturday with an opposition protester's helmet on a chair across the door. On a hilltop, looking down on the Dnipro River through trees, was a plaza for a barbecue. Families and lovers out for a different sort of Sunday afternoon excursion, posed for family album snaps at a once-in-a-lifetime occasion. Most shook their heads in wonderment at the ambitions of a president who had always proclaimed that he was on the side of the poor people of Ukraine. We did not expect anything like this. It is really extensive and all done with our money, the money of ordinary people. It really is too much for one person. It's very emotional when you see something like this, said Serhiy Remezovsky, who had brought his wife and 9-month-old son. You have the right to rule, ex-PMU Ila Tymoshenko tells Hero protesters they have removed cancer from Ukraine after her release from prison sentence. Ukrainian opposition icon and former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko spoke to supporters at a Kiev protest camp just hours after being released from a hospital where she was incarcerated. She arrived on stage in Kiev in a wheelchair and looked frail as she addressed thousands of demonstrators who had packed into Independence Square. Tymoshenko, heroine of the 2004 Orange Revolution, is the chief rival of President Viktor Yanukovych. His rule is crumbling after protesters took control of the capital Saturday and parliament voted to remove him from power. You are heroes, you are the best thing in Ukraine, she said of those killed in the violence, looking tired and speaking from a wheelchair as she addressed the euphoric crowd. She also congratulated the protesters for removing the cancer from Ukraine and demanded the ousted President Yanukovych be brought to Independence Square. This is your victory. No politicians could do what you have done, she said. This country is now free, you have given this country its freedom. You have removed this cancer from our country. I am convinced that any bullet shot through the heart of the people went through the heart of each Ukrainian. Upon her release, Tymoshenko promised to run for president and immediately went to Kiev's Independence Square. When I came to Kiev, the first thing I wanted to do was come to the barricades, she added. I wanted to feel the feelings that had all these boys and girls on the barricades had been through. All the people responsible will be brought to justice. The appearance brought Tymoshenko back to the square where she attracted world attention in the 2004 Orange Revolution protests, a riveting figure then for her rhetoric, her elaborate blonde peasant braid and her fashionable clothing. The square has been the nucleus of a 3-month protest movement that pushed Yanukovych to major concessions this week. Parliament arranged the release of the current president Viktor Yanukovych's arch-rival, who has been imprisoned since 2011. But the president said he would not recognize any of the lawmakers' decisions as valid. Her release will send shockwaves through Ukrainian politics, at a moment of deep turmoil following the worst unrest in the sprawling country since the days of the Soviet Union. Protesters claim full control of Kiev as President Yanukovych flees the capital for his support base in the Russian-friendly East. Protesters in the Ukrainian capital claimed full control of the city Saturday following the signing of a Western-brokered peace deal aimed at ending the nation's 3-month political crisis. They were seen demanding the resignation of their president and attacking politicians, a move which President Viktor Yanukovych branded a coup and likened it to the rise of Nazis in the 1930s. Viktor Yanukovych also says he has no intention of resigning or leaving the country. Hours after he and opposition leaders signed an agreement aimed at resolving the country's turmoil yesterday, Mr. Yanukovych went to Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, the heartland of his support. On Saturday, he made the coup accusation in a televised statement. The opposition has demanded a new election be held by May 25, as the pro-Russian leader's grip on power rapidly eroded following bloodshed in the capital. The nation's embattled president, Viktor Yanukovych, reportedly had fled the capital for his support base in Ukraine's Russia-leaning east. Ukraine's Border Guard Service said that a leading governor and a mayor from the president's eastern base have fled to Russia. A spokesman for the Border Guard Service, Oli Slobodian, said Kharkiv Regional Governor Mikhailo Dobkin and Kharkiv Mayor Hennady Kearns left Ukraine across the nearby Russian border. Both are top allies of President Viktor Yanukovych, whose rule appeared increasingly under question after protesters took over the capital and parliament voted to remove him. There are fears that Ukraine might split in two, creating a Russian-leaning east and Europe-leaning west. Police abandoned posts around the capital, and protesters took up positions around the presidential office and residence. Parliament discussed voting on impeaching Yanukovych and setting a quick date for new elections to end a crisis over Ukraine's identity and future direction. Yanukovych's whereabouts were unclear Saturday morning. Media outlets reported that he left Kiev for his native eastern Ukraine after surrendering much of his powers and agreeing to early elections by the end of the year. But despite the promise of an election and significant concessions, protesters blame him for police violence and amassing too many powers and want him ousted immediately. At a special parliament session on Saturday, Oli Tyanibok, head of the Nationalist Svoboda Party, called for discussion of impeachment. The parliament speaker Yanukovych ally Volodymyr Rybak announced resignation, citing ill health as the reason. The president's representative in parliament warned against splitting the country in two, an outcome that worries many but is increasingly seeming a possibility. The country's western regions want to be closer to the EU and have rejected Yanukovych's authority in many cities, while eastern Ukraine, which accounts for the bulk of the nation's economic output, favors closer ties with Russia. The president's concessions came as part of a deal intended to end violence that killed scores and left hundreds wounded in Kiev this week as snipers opened fire on protesters. It was the worst violence in Ukraine's modern history. Andrew Parubi, a leader of the protest camp on Independence Square, known as the Maidan, was quoted by the Interfax news agency as saying that Yanukovych fled for Kharkiv, the center of Ukraine's industrial heartland. Kharkiv was the capital of Soviet Ukraine from 1919 to 1934. The claims of the president's departure could not be immediately confirmed, however. A group of protesters in helmets and shields stood guard at the president's office, with few police in sight. Protesters booed opposition figures who took to a stage last night to present their deal with the president, which cuts Yanukovych's powers. Death to the criminal, some chanted, referring to Yanukovych. The root of the former Soviet nation's turmoil, the division between the Russian-speaking East and anti-Yanukovych West. The violence witnessed in Kiev this week is the worst seen in the country's 22 years as an independent nation, but the problems began when it broke away from the USSR and the leadership of worsened when Yanukovych took power. When he took power in 2010, the country had two possible futures: one was under his authoritarian rule, the other was as a member of the EU. But while some tried to shake off the Soviet past, others were still under the influence of Russia. The west of the country is denouncing Yanukovych's rule while the east and south want the rebels to be confronted with the force of government troops. When the country separated from the Soviet Union in 1991, it did so passively while obtaining vast wealth. It never fought for its independence like other former bloc states, including Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania. The main problem, however, stems from the political divide. The industrialist East, including the Crimea, and Midwestern Ukraine have always been at odds over their identity. While the East has maintained ties to Russia, people in the West have opposed the regimes and refused to recognize Yanukovych's tight grip on power. In 2004, Mr. Yanukovych was accused of trying to steal the election, and protesters reacted violently. His opponents Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko, who was released from prison on Saturday, took power instead in what has become known as the Orange Revolution. But just 6 years later, Yanukovych was democratically elected. After his election, the West turned a blind eye to his accumulation of power and wealth, even though a Kremlin style of governance was taking shape. When he began negotiating with the European Union with the aim of joining the free trade movement, he used it as an opportunity to tighten his grip over the country. During the talks, Vladimir Putin held a secret meeting with Yanukovych, and agreed to provide the ex-Soviet state with cheap gas and £9 billion in credit. As a result, the EU deal was shelved. The Russian president has never come to terms with Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. It was this attitude to former Soviet states which resulted in a 5-day war with Georgia following NATO's attempt to recruit them as a member nation. Now the geographical divisions have grown. The head of Ukraine's security service says that police stations are being taken over by anti-government demonstrators. The Crimea, however, holds most of Russia's naval fleet. There have been talks of the region seceding from the main state.